Good evening, Western Standard viewers, and welcome to Hannaford, a weekly politics show. I'm Jen Hodgson, filling in for Nigel Hannaford. My guest today is Faytene Grasseschi, a political commentator and former Conservative candidate nominee for the House of Commons and a candidate for the New Brunswick provincial legislature. But first, a word from our sponsors. This episode of The Hannaford Show is sponsored by New World Precious Metals, based right here in Alberta. Years of inflationary money printing and rising debt have decimated the average Canadian savings. Gold and silver are the only currencies that have held their value for thousands of years, and last year saw 30% gains. NWPM offers unique platforms to help protect and grow your hard-earned wealth with gold and silver. Check out newworldpm.com. Faytene Grasseschi, an Alberta-born girl and hockey mom, is a political commentator and host of a national issues commentary show that airs on networks Canada-wide, an executive director in the charitable sector, and a candidate nominated for the Federal Conservative Party and a candidate for the New Brunswick Provincial Conservatives. Faytene, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Jen. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, we're so delighted to have you. So, Faytene, given your history in politics as both a federal and provincial Conservative candidate and your work here with youth driving political change, I reckon you have some special insight into the multi-level political chaos we face as the nation.
Yeah, well, I, like you and all of your viewers, I love this nation, and I'm both a businesswoman and a mom. And so, I interface with the issues of the day from a variety of angles. And, the stakes are high, the issues are intense, and it is just a wild time in politics right now. So I'm happy to be with you today to chop out some of the issues of the day. I do want to mention, though, at the federal level, I was a nomination candidate. I lost the nomination by just a hair, and provincially, I was on the ticket. So,
right. I saw that it was really quite a close race, though. It was just by a hair, as you say. So we'll get back to any kind of political ideas you might have in the future towards the end of the show. But for now, let's just jump right into it. So the unelected Mark Carney appears to be a shoo-in for the Liberal leader coming up. We have a March 9th Liberal leadership contest. And if he wins that, he'll become the next prime minister. And again, he's unelected. So there is speculation that he would call an election right away, but some people are saying that the Liberals could de facto stay in power until 2026, even though there's an election scheduled for October 2025. And according to the charter, I think it's section 4, if there's an emergency situation like a tariff war, for example, that it could be even longer. So what do you make of that?
well, what I make of the current political climate is that things are changing not just by the day, but by the hour, by the minute, right? So I think so much of our political context right now definitely is responsive to what is happening in the United States, specifically with President Trump. And can change by the day, by the minute. So, in terms of the possibility of the federal election being pushed all the way to 2026, I think the only way that Canadians would have an ounce of that without a major outcry would be if there was a legitimate national crisis. Many people would say that the crisis that we're facing right now is not only external, it wasn't just created by the Trump tariff threat, but it's been created by poor domestic policies. The fact that we haven't been able to get our act together on the issue of domestic trade, the imbalance with equalization payments. There's a lot that we could do internally, I think, to bolster our economy, or not, I think there's a lot that we can do internally, domestically, to bolster trade, to bolster the economy, to strengthen our essential industries before we have to go so far as to declaring a national emergency that would cause the election to be delayed a year. So I think the Liberals have a pretty hard sell, given the fact that a lot of the economic crisis that we're facing was created by them and by their policies. They're going to have a hard sell with Canadians to push that election all the way to 2026. But, it's a crazy time. It's a wild time, and anything could happen. I think we've learned that.
Yeah, absolutely. We really do have to be prepared for anything. And just to your point about all of the internal solutions that Canadian politicians, both federally and provincially, could be doing, you mentioned the internal trade. I've recently discussed with both the Alberta Chamber of Commerce and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, amongst some other business agencies here in Canada at both federal and provincial levels. And they are actually all singing a similar tune that the tariffs are creating a big problem. And should they go through, there's going to be massive impacts. But this isn't just the beginning of a new issue. It's actually been something that's been going on for years or even decades with all these barriers for trade. I also heard about high taxes. We have the carbon tax being spiked again on April 1st, and that's going to be like a 20% increase for. Forgive me if I'm slightly off about that, but it's a substantial increase in the carbon tax as well. So it's not like Donald Trump just came along and created these problems for Canada. They were long standing before. And that's without even touching on the illegal immigration issues that Canada has had for years. And even legal immigration has been so wildly out of control. And in addition to that is we're learning more and more just what an issue this fentanyl problem has been. So in light of the Liberal leadership race, it's like Parliament has been put on pause for this prorogation. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on January 6th, as you know, he announced his intention to resign, but we haven't actually seen any fruit of that except for a prorogued Parliament and Liberal candidates scrambling to get their act together for this leadership contest. So how do we square this circle when we have so much going on that needs to be addressed from not just an internal perspective, but internationally? We're dealing with Trump and the tariffs and all the different issues that are collectively adding towards something that we need to really address, but we don't have anyone seated in the House of Commons right now.
Yeah, it's incredibly concerning and disappointing, obviously, to have a dysfunctional parliament at such a critical moment in our national timeline here. So, listen, there are so many different things that you said there, but let's go with the low hanging fruit. First of all, let's get our domestic trade flowing, and let's face it, if the one thing that Trump's tariff threats accomplish is that we get those pipelines built, that we get energy east flowing, that we start getting our resources to markets on both the Pacific and the Atlantic coast, that will be a huge win. Now, obviously, that's not going to happen in a minute. It takes more than a day to build a pipeline. And so we have to be looking at what are some of the other economic levers that can be pulled that are immediate, other than just starting a massive trade war with the United States of America. And the low hanging fruit, Jen, is that carbon tax. It really, really is. This has been one of the deepest grinds on Canadians in the last decade. And the average Canadian household right now, as I understand it, is paying just under $1,000 per annum in carbon tax. Well, let's get rid of that. That's just the household burden. We understand as well that this carbon tax is putting immense pressure on our industries, those costs are being passed on to the consumer in a multiplicity of ways. It is a massive contributor to inflation. So let's start with what we can do right now. And I want to applaud the voices of common sense that have been saying this really now for years. And sometimes a little bit of an external pain makes us wake up to some of the conversations that we might not have been open to in the past. And I want to say this, like I'm an Alberta girl originally, but I've really lived all over the nation. I lived in Vancouver, went to university there, and then have built my life kind of across the nation. We're in New Brunswick right now. And Jen, I've noticed that a lot of Eastern Canadians really don't understand the policy press that has been put on the financial economic engine of our nation, namely Alberta and Western Canada. It's not that they don't care, it's just that they don't know. It's not something that is widely talked about. And what's happening here with the discourse surrounding the tariffs and with the strong leadership of Premier Danielle Smith is it's bringing this conversation to the fore in a way that I think is really critical, important, and probably the lightest word in the mix I could use there would just be healthy. Like, this needs to be a conversation where we've got $300 billion in equalization payments over the last several decades, and yet an all-out war on the very industry that makes those payments possible. We need to have a conversation. So I would say I would advocate for beginning with the conversations we can have domestically, internally. Let's get some stuff done here at home. And then let's learn how to be diplomats on the international stage and not just throw mud from over the fence. Like, I applaud Danielle Smith and her leadership. I think she's demonstrating how to get it done.
Yes, I agree. I think that Premier Smith is doing a great job. It's really refreshing to see such a strong, level-headed voice come out in defense of Canada, in defense of Alberta, and without taking on this Team Canada rhetoric either that the federal Liberals are all of a sudden putting forward without without too long ago in recent memory was the Freedom Convoy, where the federal Liberals, of course, were acting like anyone who was on so-called Team Canada was some kind of a domestic terrorist or something, calling the Emergencies Act, which was recently appealed in the federal court by the Trudeau Liberals. So, but to circle back to about what you mentioned about the carbon tax and how that is impacting us internally, how do you think that makes us look on the world stage? We're really the only nation that has these kind of measures anymore. We see other Western nations walking back these climate policies. So, how do you think it makes us look, and what does it do for our attractiveness as global trading partners? We're facing down the barrel of a gun of this looming trade war. Who's going to be wanting to do business with Canada with all of these extra taxes, including this astronomical carbon tax that is tacked on to all of our goods and commodities?
Yeah, you make a really important point. How do we look on the international stage? I haven't asked any of my international friends and colleagues, particularly on this issue, but I'd have to say we look ridiculous. Our emissions output is 1.4% of global emissions. The last time I researched it, maybe we're somewhere near 1.6%, but we're definitely not past 2.
I hadn't even
And,
heard of
for decades, I remember back in probably around 2009, Stephen Harper saying, "Listen, we could tank our entire economy as we drive towards net zero and really make almost no impact on the global emissions footprint." And, that's just logical, right? And so, we do need to think about our families. We need to think about our businesses. We need to think about creating that climate once again. Speaking of self-sabotage, creating that climate once again where Canada becomes attractive to business, and that those of us here that are business owners like myself, are actually able to flourish and build a life for their families that is prosperous. And so these are no-brainers. These are no-brainers. And we are at a time where the pendulum needs to come back. Crazy has just gotten more crazy on some of these frontiers. And it's time to begin to look at these things pragmatically, logically, and ask those tough questions like, why in the world are we killing our economies, these various industries, when it's really having a negligible impact on global emissions?
Yeah, we really got to get the adults back in the room, back in the House of Commons, where these matters can be actually discussed with leadership and with a leader that has a mandate from the Canadian people. So, just again back to the Mark Carney and Liberal leadership. So, Carney, there's speculation that he would call an election right away because he would just become the de facto prime minister if he wins the leader liberalship race, which it looks like he's going to do. So, what do you see happening So Parliament is coming back March 24th. That's when the prorogation is over. The leader liberalship contest is going to be just a few weeks before that on March 9th. So we're going to have a new prime minister in place, and it's not going to be elected by Canadians. It's going to be someone elected by liberals, essentially, and they're going to be leading the country. So a lot of people are looking at the polls, looking to see when is the next election, because many Canadians are liking what they hear from Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. But it seems like there's still a few hurdles to jump over. And as I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, it seems like there is a constitutional mechanism, I think you even said that earlier, that would keep the Liberals and ergo Carney, should he win the leadership race, in power even beyond 2026 if Parliament votes to repeal, of course. And with the support of Jagmeet Singh in the NDP, that very well could happen.
Yeah, there's so much in what you just outlined there, but just to say this, in politics, usually polling rules the day, unfortunately. And that is, again, so discouraging and disheartening as someone who loves Canada, and I know you're in the same boat, and is deeply concerned about the trajectory that our nation has been on. Like, we need an election for the sake of the will of democracy to be expressed. But we know that, political parties, they're going to be looking at the polls, they're going to be looking at the temperature of what's happening in the United States of America and President Trump's policies, like how that's going to be impacting the political climate. It seems like the Liberals are trying to set themselves up to be campaigning against President Trump, not against Pierre Poilievre. And so they're going to be watching these things. Obviously, political parties always try to strike when they think that it is most beneficial to them. So again, like I said earlier, anything could happen. So I really feel like it's wisdom just for people to engage at the grassroots level right now and not take anything for granted. You mentioned the whole dynamic that we will have a prime minister that was not elected by the Canadian people, but rather by the members of the Liberal Party. And now the deadline has passed. I don't know what the membership is at right now for the federal Liberals, but I do know that when Justin Trudeau ran, he won, believe it was with 90,000 votes. So if you weigh 90,000 votes up against 40 million people, that's 90,000 people deciding for 40 million
Well,
that Justin Trudeau was going to be the official leader of the opposition back in the day. So, yeah, you're right. But this just illustrates why it is so important for people to get involved in grassroots partisan politics with the party that most represents their views and values. Because if you're involved in things like these leadership races, you're going to be the one that sets the temperature in the room. And I think it goes without saying, I need to highlight this right now because I'm not sure why we're not talking about this one more. And that is that there are nominations that are being rolled out all across Canada right now. As a matter of fact, I just got an email yesterday from somebody, right, just a stone's throw from you right there, Jen, in Calgary. There's a nomination that just opened up in Bow River, I believe. It'll be closed by the time this is airing. But these nominations are rolling out right now. And lots of these nominations will be determined by just a couple dozen Canadians that buy a membership in the party that they resonate with. And it's going to be those Canadians that literally set the climate for our nation going forward. We know up until about a month ago, most of the polls were projecting a super majority for Pierre Poilievre. So to be honest, the more important elections, it's really not the Liberal leadership race, if those polls are true. It's actually those nominations that are happening all across Canada right now that are going to determine the climate of the Conservative caucus and the climate of the House of Commons here within, well, we'll see, 6 or 18 months.
yeah, well, that's such an interesting point because I think for a while there, the conservative movement was feeling pretty confident that Pierre Poilievre had it in the bag or has it in the bag for a supermajority. However, there's been kind of a toss up since this liberal leadership race got going with a lot of liberals who had jumped ship under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Now with Mark Carney, things, seem to have shifted a little bit. He seems to have some appeal for some former liberals or liberals that were starting to feel wishy-washy and maybe said that they would vote conservative because they want to see someone that's a little bit more competent in the leadership role as the nation's leader. And so people, I think, are finding some likability perhaps in Mark Carney. And we see in the polls recently, you say polls are what really demonstrates the situation, that actually the liberals are starting to gain a little bit more ground. So just as we're wrapping it up, you mentioned about grassroots movements and that it's not so much the big general election that is going to have the pull, but in these smaller by-elections, and what are some other ways that people on a more local level, or more grassroots level can get involved and can really play a role, a democratic role in what is to come of this nation?
That's a great question, and thank you so much for it. I think the most important thing that your viewers can do, the listeners can do after they are done listening to this podcast is to go and make sure that your membership is active in the party that most represents your views and values, and just get in the room. It's not the people that are outside of the room that determine the temperature and the conversations. It's the people that are in the room. And then once you're in the room, raise your hand, every time that there's an opportunity to volunteer and to serve. And I always encourage the people that I lead to come with a service heart, to come with a heart of honor. I think we are all so weary and tired of toxic politics, right? And we can be that change. I say, get in the room with courage, be a voice for the things that you care about, but also do it in a way that is going to foster unity and a culture of kindness. Like I just came through one of the most toxic elections that, oh my gosh, it was crazy. It was just crazy. And I just, all of us have to decide, number one, we're either going to be in the room or we're not, because it's only going to be the people in the room that have sway. And number two, we're going to be that person in the room that contributes to a healthy culture within our political discourse, or we're not. And so I think those are the two. If we all just did those two basic things, got in the room and then helped contribute to a healthy culture, then we would see change in our nation within short order for sure.
Wow, that is so good. Thank you so much for that perspective and for wrapping up the show on a positive note because, we can sit back and comment on all these political unfoldings, but until people realize that actually it's up to we, the people, and decide to get involved ourselves, and that's where the change really comes from. So I love hearing that. And Faytene, it's been amazing to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Faytene Grasseschi, who has her show on Faytene TV, and she is a former conservative candidate for the House of Commons nominee and for the provincial legislature in New Brunswick. Faytene, any last words?
Oh, no, it's just been wonderful to be with you, Jen. This is great. And maybe I'll just land it with the words of a very honorable Albertan, the Honorable Preston Manning. Let's just get out there and do something.
Sounds great. Yeah, those are amazing parting words. So thank you to you. Thank you to the Honorable Preston Manning for his insight. I saw that you just recently did a segment or 4-show segment with him. So thank you, Faytene, and all the best to you.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you for joining us for the Hannaford Show this week. I'm Jen Hodgson.